Ladies and gentlemen, and the men of the Alaska Army National Guard, thank you for attending my presentation tonight. Scout. A scout is a man trained in the use of ground and cover, rifle marksmanship, map reading, observation, and accurately reporting the results of his observations. A scout is a high type of soldier, an active, intelligent, trustworthy, courageous, skillful athlete. He acts alone, not a member of the team. By choice, he does not fight, but he's an expert at the hit-and-run art of single combat. By choice, he does not shoot, but if forced to, he shoots quickly, carefully, and as little as possible. One round, one hit, and then vanishes. That is his motto. That is the United States Army definition of the Scout 1870. On October 18, 1867, following the orders of Secretary of State William Seward and General Ulysses S. Grant, Major General Jefferson C. Davis, United States Army, signed for and took control of Alaska. When signing for the new territory, the Army assumed command of all the land and people, which included U.S. citizens, Alaska natives, and Russians. Thus began a relationship between Alaskans and the members of the United States military, a relationship that has continued to the present. Over time, the military-civilian relationship in Alaska has been described a few different ways. Many of the first Alaskan settlers viewed the military as nothing more than an unwanted arm of the federal government, which demanded the military to leave the territory immediately. Military occupiers, which only slowed down the advances of the territory and its pioneers. Pioneers that were trying to move Alaska into the future. Washington, D.C.'s middlemen, that cared nothing about the Alaskan populace and was nothing more than a military force that used intimidation techniques in order to get public conformity. Some might say the pioneers had good reason to feel this way. When the Army took control of Alaska, it had the right to take all lands they saw as mission essential, including those of already established settlers. Claim of preemption and settlements are not only without the sanction of law, but are in direct violations of laws applicable to the public domain. Military force may be used to remove intruders if necessary. This order from General Grant allowed General Davis to stop all civil laws that most Americans take for granted. Collecting debts, getting married, writing wills, even holding a trial for a murder case. What the settlers did not understand is that General Davis personally tried to make as little impact as possible on the already established land and its people. He was led to believe, just as they were, that the Army stay in Alaska would be brief, and that the federal government was going to act quickly in sending a representative to assist the populace in establishing a territorial government, which allowed the general and his force which would have allowed the general and his force to exit Alaska as fast as it could. That exit would not come until 1877. Now, some of you have seen the Army of 1867 as a force that was misused and mistreated by the political powers of the United States, a military unit that was given an unrealistic mission with no clear objectives or long-term goals to pursue, which did the best job it could given the unique challenges it found in Alaska. No matter what side of the fence one sits on when examining the Army in Alaska, the fact is they were sent here to conduct a mission that those in Washington, D.C. had ordered. Alaskans and military personnel would end up living in close proximity of each other and have to make the best of the situation until the federal government decided on what they were going to do. From 1867 to the eve of World War II, the two cultures had their differences, but one story that is deeply intertwined into both of these cultures, which historians have not discussed thoroughly enough, is a story of when Alaskan citizens began to answer the call to take up arms in the defense of their territory and their nation. I believe that many negative feelings that overshadowed the relationship between the civilian and military cultures in Alaska were put to rest when Alaskans began serving in both the Alaska Army National Guard and the Alaska Territorial Guard. These citizen soldiers, military service, has been a conduit in helping bring military and civilian cultures closer together. thus shifting the negative military perception out of Alaska. Don't get me wrong, the federal money that poured into the state during World War II, the Cold War, and which continues to pour in, has helped as well. But it was the bonds that developed between soldiers, citizen soldiers, that truly helped Alaskans see that in many cases, the military had been the victim of a much unjustified criticism. 74 years after the Army first signed for Alaska, the military presence took on a new personal look. With the clouds of war erupting over Europe, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order number 8756, authorizing Alaska to establish a National Guard on May 17, 1941. This order gave birth to the 297th Infantry. For the first time in Alaska's history, actual Alaskan citizens were now offered the opportunity to become a part of the military culture that they had lived with for so long. They would now be able to serve their territory and country, doing it from their own backyards. Units were stood up immediately in Juneau, Ketchikan, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. 1 month after being established, the threats grew larger in Europe when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Some of the Guardsmen believed that the proximity of Alaska to Russia would possibly have them defending Alaska from the Germans, or attacking the Germans shoulder to shoulder with their Russian neighbors. The volunteers of the Alaska National Guard were excited to have this opportunity to serve. They were happy that men like Territorial Governor Ernest Gruening had fought so hard with the federal government in getting them to authorize the Alaska Guard. Gruening fought with Washington because in January 41, at a meeting with the War Department, he was told the main policy of the military was to take care of Europe and defend the lifeline to Australia, and the military would do what they could about holding Alaska. Gruening said, "I knew right then that Alaska was seen as expendable." Just as Alaska was standing up its new force, the clouds of the Second World War were growing bigger, and the Roosevelt administration could see the writing on the wall. So on September 15, 1941, the Alaska Army National Guard was federalized, thus becoming a part of the regular Army, and was realigned under the Alaska Defense Command, led by General Simon Bolivar Buckner, again, leaving the vulnerable territory without its own adequate fighting force. Due to having Native Alaskans within the ranks of the newly formed 297th, they found little respect from General Buckner. Buckner set out using the unit to perform whatever missions that could be found in Alaska that would keep the 297th out of the way. But even the obvious negative attitudes from the regular Army did not dampen the men's spirits. Many felt that they were not going to let an outsider from the regular Army dampen their attitude. They were still going to do what they could for their homes and loved ones. As the war escalated, Buckner would have no choice but to utilize and treat the men of the 297th like a regular Army unit. General Buckner's attitude toward the 297 changed very quickly, especially after the Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor on 3 June 1942. Shortly before the attack, a very special test unit had been organized. A unit that some believe gave birth to the term Alaskan Scout. The unit was the first Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon. One of those scouts, Sergeant Donald Spaulding, had been on Valley Blue Mountain above Dutch Harbor when the Japanese started their attack. His radio reporting back to General Buckner at Fort Richardson was later described as cool, calm, impartial, correct, and the best received during that raid. Led by Colonel Lawrence V. Kastner, a West Point graduate of 1932. These men would have the great responsibility of landing on the island of the two prior to any American forces and gather any intelligence that commanders would need prior to the main landings. Colonel Kastner realized that Alaska was full of unique people, but it was the weather and terrain that gave mission planners the most challenges, especially when planning a major amphibious assault on Alaska's dangerous seas. Colonel Kastner wanted local men that would know how to work and survive in the rugged terrain of Alaska. He felt there was no time to teach non-Alaskan military personnel. He needed locals, and he needed them now. Who better to fill this role than the men of the 297th? Hard and dangerous men is what Kastner was seeking, and that is just what he found in men like Bad Whiskey Red, a Luke Pete, and Water Bucket Ben. You think he was dehydrated. Having an already hardened disposition, the men of the 1st Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon would eventually be nicknamed Kastner's Cutthroats. Once the intelligence had been gathered and the main assault had begun, the cutthroats soon realized that they would be responsible for taking care of more than just gathering intel. It was obvious that no one at the planning table had taken their warnings of having proper winter gear issued to the main assault force. Unprepared regular Army soldiers landed on a tube in summer gear, as represented there, and very quickly realized that they'd be fighting not just against the deadly Japanese, but also the harsh Alaskan weather. The cutthroats were credited with saving many lives that would have been lost due to the extreme Alaskan weather and terrain. Proving that men of Alaska were fully capable of fighting and surviving in harsh conditions, the regular Army shifted attention to the 297th Infantry and started assigning them responsibilities in defending many of Alaska's islands that were then seen as possible future landing sites the Japanese might utilize the next time they invaded. From that time forward until the end of the war, men of the 297th dug in and waited for the Japanese to return. They were assigned places like Moses Point, Excursion Inlet, St. Paul Island, Nome, St. George Island, and once the fighting was finished, the island of Batu. Over the course of the war, these men would be living in some of the harshest conditions that no military personnel in either Europe or the Pacific Theater could imagine. Many men of the 297th distinguished themselves while defending their homes. They infiltrated enemy lines during the Battle of Batu. They reported intelligence information back to military planners. They mapped coastlines that were previously unknown to the Army. They trained new infantry units how to survive in the Arctic, and they saved lives of men that would have definitely perished in the Alaskan weather. As the war in Alaska came to a halt, the men of the 297th were brought back in from their positions around the state and were informed that they'd be heading to California or some to New York. A few would be able to stay in Alaska for the duration and continue working for the Alaska Defense Command. To the Pacific, Europe, or at home, these Alaskans would continue to distinguish themselves wherever Uncle Sam sent them. Now, over the course of the war, especially during the years of 1941 and 42, when the Alaska National Guard was federalized, and with the bombing of Dutch Harbor already taking place, the fear of a Japanese army invading mainland Alaska was at the forefront of all Alaskans' minds, especially that of Governor Gruning's. When the 297th was federalized, he had to start at square one in providing a fighting force for Alaska. He set out to find a fix for his problem. He found his answer when he was given a report from a major the natives had nicknamed Moktuk. With the assistance of Major Moktuk Marvin Marston, the governor was able to accomplish two things. One, establish a fighting force that could answer to the territorial government, and two, allow Alaska Native Americans the chance to prove to the United States that they were just as capable and brave as any Americans in time of war. Equipped with 7,500 rounds of ammunition and a case of Enfield rifles, the two men set out in a single-motor plane on pontoons on a recruitment drive that would make any current-day Army recruiter proud. Their tour took them to places like Dillingham, Hooper Bay, Mountain Village, Nuyaviak Island, and Deering, just to name a few. Once in the villages, the two men met with village elders and asked for their help. At each stop, Governor Gruning said, "I am coming to you for help. The Japanese have bombed our ships at Pearl Harbor, and they dropped their bombs on Alaska at Dutch Harbor. They will come with more bombs. We do not know where they will strike next. Uncle Sam does not have enough soldiers to watch all of your coastline. Will you help keep the Japanese out? If you see a strange boat, plane, or man anywhere, will you send a message to the Army? If the Japanese come ashore, will you shoot him? All you men who will help us fight against the Japanese, please step forward and sign your name." And with that, the Alaska Territorial Guard was born. Now, looking back at Governor Gruning's plea today, it may seem a bit over the top. But in 1942, the fact was no one knew what the Japanese had in store for Alaska. The entire west coast was virtually unprotected. As Major Marston was visiting remote areas as early as 41, he soon realized there was a group of Alaskan subject matter experts that virtually overnight, with little formal Army training, could become a cohesive unit used for intelligence gathering, down pilot rescue, or hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. No matter how you look at it, these men could be an immediate force multiplier for Alaska and the Army Defense Command. Major Marston had tried his best to have his guerrilla force initiated in 41, but soon found himself engaged in a red tape battle with General Buckner. After submitting his initial briefing to General Buckner's staff, he was told, "The general is interested in your idea, but without the authority to act past Anchorage." Not getting the support he wanted from the Army, Marston sent his idea out to anyone that would read it. Eventually, the report went across the desk of Colonel Castor, the brainchild of the Cutthroats. He immediately sent that report on to Governor Gruning. Governor Gruning insisted that Major Marston become one of his military aides immediately. So, as Gruning and Marston would travel the remote areas of Alaska, they quickly built a force. Men and women of the villages were excited to have such a chance to work with the United States Army. They were greatly impressed that these two men were asking for their help. Finally, someone was taking the Alaskan natives and their expert of understanding the Alaskan terrain into consideration. Another aspect that made them excited was the United States was going to give them all rifles and ammunition, which they did. Supplying an army in the ATG was going to be a serious issue. The regular army let Gruning know that there would be no way they could assist in transportation of equipment to remote villages. So, the ATG turned to a man that would be another important figure in the history of the unit. The man was Otto Geist. Based in Nome, Geist took to the quartermaster job like a seal does to water. He called in personal favors and did everything humanly possible to get the much-needed supplies out to the remote villages. Once the ATG units were established and supplied, they got to work. They were issued and trained on U.S. military radios and how to send important intelligence reports. Being from a culture that raised their children to be masters of situational awareness, the men of the ATG sent reports fast and highly accurate. So fast that many of the Army communications and intel personnel on the other end in Fairbanks and in Anchorage had difficulty keeping up. This key aspect of the ATG, intelligence reporting, would play a pivotal role in the future against Russia. One of the more important missions that they would be responsible for was downed pilot rescue and recovery. During World War II, radar was not a common item found in military aircraft. ATG units were credited with saving numerous downed pilots, some of them being from Russian airmen that would sometimes crash on the way back to Russia with planes given to them through the Lend-Lease program. Another mission they performed was the tracking, shooting down, and recovering of Japanese unmanned balloons. These balloons were launched from Japan with the intention of landing within the United States and with the hopes of causing massive damage to random targets and causing fear amongst the American populace on the West Coast. The men of the ATG performed all these duties and toward the end of the war started teaching Arctic survival skills to the regular Army. A school that would be reopened and taught by members of the ATG when they made the switch to the National Guard in the 1950s. Their World War II contribution was made during a frightening and unsure time, and they did all of this for no money. They only had the hopes that their contribution would be remembered by those in Alaska and that they would be recognized as brave Americans that answered the call during a time of war. Before the end of the war, the men of the ATG were put on the map when this famous painting by Magnus Rusty Herlin was put on display around the United States during a war bond drive in 1944. At the end of the war, the fighting 297th came home and was redesignated the 208th Infantry and deactivated in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The men of the ATG were able to hold on with Major Marston for another 6 months and then were deactivated. Once the men of the 297th were back, their families were happy to have them. No longer could these mothers and fathers see the military with such disdain before the war. These were, after all, their sons, wearing the uniform of the United States Army. How could a parent, neighbor, former school teacher, college professor, or any other Alaskan look at these men and blame them for the problems between Alaska and the Washington, D.C.? The answer is they couldn't. The same goes for the men of the ATG. Men that had once been all but ignored by so many had now been recognized for their contributions made during the war. As long as there were men like Major Muktuk Marston and Ernest Gruning, the Alaskan natives would have a voice that would be let people know just how devoted and patriotic these silent professionals were. As World War II ended, the United States would enter the Cold War and have a new enemy which geographically close to his borders, close enough for Sarah Palin to see from her front porch. So on May 11th, 1949, both the ATG and the 297th would come back to life and be merged together as one in the Alaska Army National Guard. From there, they would continue to serve their territory and eventually their state. 1 weekend a month. they would be constant reminders that when Alaskans had issue with the federal government, it wasn't the soldier that should take the blame. Thank you.
Questions for Danny?
I'm a nice guy. I like to talk.
Yeah, I was wondering, as far as Native Alaskans in the Guard nowadays, is there as high percentage as there was when they formed the ATG?
No, and I think that's just across the board as far as military as a whole. But there is still the tradition of my grandfather was in the ATG, my great-grandfather, my father was in the Guard, you know, my brother's in the Guard. So certain families still have that tradition, they still uphold it, and they still continue to serve. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I heard a story, I'm not remembering it fully or correctly, but it was something about that I guess the government wanted to give sort of second-class rifles to the ATG, and Marston said, no way, they're going to have first-class rifles like
Yeah,
everybody
that's
else
correct. Yeah, they tried to get them old Springfield 1902s from World War I, but no ammo. And Marston fought, and he found some in a warehouse in Seattle, and he had them shipped up here. And then the big army wanted to take the weapons away after the war, even though Marston and Groening had promised these weapons to them, they're yours to keep. And Otto Geist, I think it was, came with the idea, just tell them that the natives have germs that they can't clean off. So they got to keep their weapons.
So was that the biggest incentive for the Alaska Natives to join the ATG? Was it the rifles, or I mean, was it just?
No, it was the rifles helped, yeah, but it was the patriotic. They felt that finally someone was coming to them and asking them for help. Green and Mugtut made it very apparent that we're asking you. We're not telling you. We're not forcing you. We need your help.
And then also, I noticed you talked about they also asked women to join. Was there a willingness for women to join?
Yeah, there are 40 women total joined, and they were nurses. They were trained on nursing and things like that for the villages. And Mugtut Marston, he ended up living up and down the range on the west coast the duration of the war. He sent his family back to the lower 48, and he stayed up here to the 50s, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, didn't General Simon Bolivar Buckner, he went on to become the commanding general of Okinawa, is that the same person?
Yeah, he was killed in Okinawa,
Yeah, he
actually.
was killed toward the end of the war.
That's the same.
He's Army, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
First time in American history to command the Marine Corps, wasn't he?
I believe he was. Yeah, first time Army was commanding Marines. Dr. Cole?
Bonnie, do you think that it did have any political impact after the war that they had done this?
As far as Groening and...
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. When Groening ran for office, things like that, he always had support on the West Coast, well, throughout the entire state of Alaska, or territory. Because it wasn't just the West Coast, you had the ATG. Word of mouth carried, and you had, throughout the entire state, territory at that time, you had people joining the ATG. So yeah, he definitely had a huge following as far as that.
Were they granted veteran benefits?
No, they were never granted veterans benefits. Big Army fought them on that, and then during Senator Stevens' reign, he was actually able to get them recognition. There was a medal that was made, and there's a gentleman in our unit now, Staff Sergeant Bolivar. He's in charge of our Honor Guard unit, and to this day, he's still passing out flags to guys who passed away years ago. But we're doing our best as the Army National Guard in honoring those guys.
I was just about that.